Hi everyone and welcome to Hit the Apex. It's the week following the Italian Grand Prix. Plenty to discuss on this edition, but the big question to ask is it all over Red Rover? And we're going to talk plenty about that later on. But the Italian Grand Prix, Baden, we're back from our mid-season break and we've already had back-to-back weekends and potentially two championship-defining rounds, but more so this one here in Monza. Crazy race we thought was going to go in Ferrari's favour, but in the end it was the Silver Arrows that spoiled the Scuderia's party.
Oh, it's hard to know where to start, really, when you see after Saturday, Ferrari were the ones with it all to lose, and that's exactly what they did, or what Vettel did more precisely, and then Ferrari in a roundabout way to Kimi Räikkönen when he finally had that golden opportunity, and then testament to Mercedes, yes, questionable their tactics, but they got the win, and I think that it really, at this point, it's looking like from an unlikely scenario where we said, Hamilton's leading the title, but it's a matter of when he's going to be overhauled by Vettel. Now you can't see it happening.
No, you can't indeed, and we'll talk more about Vettel and the championship a bit later on, extension perhaps of the piece that you wrote today, but talking about the race itself, so Hamilton wins, 6th win of the season, extends the championship lead, and it all just boils back to what happened on the first lap, and there was already tensions between Vettel and Hamilton. Vettel starting on the front row of the grid, Hamilton third. They get together at turn 4, and Seb was spun round. The incident, perhaps Seb being a bit too ambitious again, coming together with Hamilton, found himself in a spin, ended up dropping back as far as 17th, I think it was, and then had to just basically do a race of recovery, which saw him recover to finish. It was 4th in the end, but a lot of points lost there for Seb. But it was Kimi who was holding on to the lead for most of the race, being pursued by Hamilton. It was track position was Kimi's before the pit stops. After the pit stops, which Kimi was pitted quite early, you have to say, lap 23, by Ferrari, and that's probably the big talking point, is that, he could have gone longer because Hamilton ended up doing 8 more laps on those same super soft tyres.
Yeah, Ferrari, again, unwilling to let nature take its course. They were very conservative on this front, and that coupled with that idea that when Räikkönen did have the clean air, they didn't rein him in when he had built that sufficient lead to emerge when Hamilton made his own stop 6 laps later. It was more than sufficient, and by that point his tyres were cactus, and that was only when he came into Bottas's wake, and before we know it, Hamilton had pretty much wiped out that deficit that Räikkönen had, 6 seconds or so, and it counted for nothing. And even by the time you see Bottas brought in, he clearly wasn't any kind of consideration for what he could have achieved, and it was only a matter of when a lame duck Räikkönen was to be devoured by Hamilton.
Well, yeah, Bottas deployed again by Mercedes to hold up Kimi, very much the wingman now, after, even though Mercedes denied that before the mid-season break. And Lewis Hamilton was able to attack on those fresh tyres, as we saw, because Valtteri essentially holding up Kimi there. And when Bottas came and pitted on lap 39 or whatever it was, Hamilton was able to make the move on Kimi lap 45, not too long before the end of the race going into turn 1. By that point, Kimi, his tyres shot, not because he couldn't manage them, because they were 8 laps older than Hamilton's, contrary to what the commentary at the time was saying, that Kimi and the Ferrari are poor tyre managers or whatever. I don't know where they got that idea from, but Hamilton as well, he wasn't managing his tyres all that great either. He had graining and everything as well, but just because he had fresher rubber, let's stress that again, fresher rubber, that's why he had the better grip to get past Räikkönen.
Yeah, I just think that, and when you consider that overall, perhaps he, in those laps where he wasn't pushing like crazy for 6 or 7 beyond that operating window, yes, perhaps that was putting it over the edge for Räikkönen, but when it came down to it, Räikkönen did a pretty good job in hindsight when you saw how worn they were down to a carcass in the dying laps just to hold on to the line, so you couldn't really go out and say that he was reckless. It was just a case of Ferrari flustering themselves and then being the ones who were negligent to not inform Raikkonen when the time was right, that he had done enough, and that was really, there was no coming back from that.
Well, it didn't really help either that they only had the one set of soft tyres all weekend, both the Ferrari guys, so they didn't actually get to go out in the practice sessions and use them. So, just having them on in the race, and they perhaps didn't predict that they'd be in, under that much pressure during the race. So there you go, strategy error as well as far as Ferrari is concerned. And, in the end, he finished second, which the only consolation prize from that is that he achieved his 100th F1 podium. But considering the emotion that we saw on Saturday, especially from his wife as well, when he took that pole position, and pretty much the entire world, everyone, there wasn't anyone who was unhappy that Raikkonen was on pole position. We thought perhaps finally we'd be able to see him break that duck that goes back to 2013, the Australian Grand Prix at that, since he last won a race. And now, it's that opportunity gone, whether it's going to happen again at the end of the season. And we'll talk about it in the digest as well. It might not be, this season might be his last anyway.
Yeah, I think, as we've said so frequently, particularly in the last 18 months, when he's been a lot more realistically in contention there, that matter of when, not if, and been left tantalised when he's been scapegoated so many times for Vettel. This was his opportunity, and he did really on his own end everything right, but the strategy really blew it for him, and you do wonder if that's as good as it's going to get for him. As much as Vettel keeps tripping over himself, Ferrari seems like they're just at a stage where they're just gifting every opportunity to Mercedes, and it was one of those races where Hamilton could have settled for second if he was really being ultra-conservative, but Ferrari just had nothing to give, and it just fell completely into place for the Silver Arrows.
Exactly, and to sort of rub further salt into that wound, the podium was completed by the wingman, Valtteri Bottas, who I guess was elevated due to a 5-second penalty being handed out to Max Verstappen, and it was a late battle between Bottas and Verstappen that saw a bit of botched defence in Verstappen's case or whatever, which saw him handed that penalty, and Max wasn't too happy about that either, and that penalty actually then dropped him to 5th in the end, and that elevated Seb up to 4th to make it a decent recovery from him.
Yeah, I think for Verstappen, there's a slight step back after some really great inroads after that real melee he had in the first 5 races, where he seemed to find trouble at every corner, and I guess it's just a manifestation of that frustration probably shared by his teammate and Ricciardo. It seems like every weekend one or the other, but more often than not lately it is the Australian there who
it's
seems
what we
to
say
be
every
up in a,
it's what we say every week about Red Bull, that it's either one or the other.
But at the moment it seems more so to be the departing Ricciardo, but Verstappen clearly doesn't want to be fighting for the minor placings, and you can see that red mist which really came down over him when he was informed of that penalty. He pretty much just left it all on the racetrack at that point.
Well, yeah, the sort of petulance came back for them, but going over to Daniel Ricciardo now, 4th DNF in 6 races. It was only last week where we said, 3 DNF in 5 races. Hopefully that'll he'll come out and score some points at least this time out. But yeah, it was a 4th DNF in 6 races, and it was a clutch issue that destroyed his race this time. So, can he... It just seems like he can't take a trick at the moment, can Paul Ricciardo. He's won 2 races this season. The only other driver... other than Vettel and Hamilton to have won multiple races. And he was looking good to probably lock out 5th in the championship, but, losing all those points, it's not going to happen now.
Oh, 5th after he won Monaco, he was probably fancying 3rd, and ever since then, it's just been as though he's non-existent, and I think he's been no better than 5th at any point, just because he gets such poor luck with either grid penalty or failures when he's running in a pretty good position. Yeah,
5th is probably the best result he's had since Monaco, and mind you, he's only finished twice or 3 times since then as well. So, looking ahead to Singapore, I guess it's a circuit that will suit Red Bull better, and, Spa Monza's always a test for Red Bull ever since the hybrid era started. So, they're probably glad that these races are behind them. But again, for Dan, it's just, we say it'd be nice if he had some good results under his belt before he leaves Red Bull, just to have it on good terms. But at the moment it's looking pretty grim.
And again, I think the question has to be asked whether that the Renault power unit, which has been quite fickle, particularly this season, it started off the end of last season, you saw that disastrous conclusion they had with Toro Rosso, but now with Red Bull making its plans announced to move to Honda, and you think about Adrian Newey and his notoriously tight architecture, whether it's just getting to a point where it can't accommodate the Renault, and they'll just both parties be hoping to draw a line under it and go their respective ways at this stage, because it's just become so recurring that there's clearly a fundamental issue there on Renault perhaps and Red Bull's end, where they're just clearly not matching up, and it's just a shame that Ricciardo is going to end what has been really quite a great tenure at Red Bull, and who knows, it could have gone a little bit differently. He could have been their guy to take them back to titles, but it shouldn't end up being that he'll end with really a damp squib when he's racing as well as he has when he is on the track. But it's just every race we're now accustomed to seeing disappointment.
Yeah, and it's just pretty painful to see. And, it was when we saw it this time at Monza, it was just a case of not again, but probably a lot more emotional than that. But yeah, so hopefully Singapore, it's a circuit that typically suits Red Bull, and they should be able to get some results there, especially for Dan under his belt. But elsewhere in the race, Romain Grosjean was best of the rest with 6th, but that was before he was disqualified for having an illegal car. So there was a breach with the floor design on the Haas car. Apparently the FIA was looking at it for multiple races, and they decided to act on it now. And as a result, 6th was stripped from Haas for that. Otherwise, that could have put them ahead of Renault in the Constructors' Championship. And with that, it elevated quite a few drivers up the order. We had the Force India's elevated to 6th and 7th, who now leapfrog Toro Rosso to P7 in the standings. So within 2 races, they've already scored, enough points to get up to 7th in the standings, leapfrogging 3 teams. And then Williams, best result since Baku for them, with Sergei Sirotkin promoted to 10th, scoring his first points in F1. Lance Stroll scored a couple of points too, but now we've had all drivers score points this season.
Yeah, it's good to see for everyone to get on the act, but for Haas particularly, there was a bit of a conjecture whether that deadline to change the floor was going to be for Singapore, and then there was a bit of talk that they had sent an email clarifying it to the FIA, and they hadn't heard a response, so they took that as being the go-ahead to continue with that spec, which was under investigation. So who knows whether there'll be anything more to play out before we reach Singapore. But as it does stand, it does mean that Sirotkin gets his first point in Formula One, and just all around for Williams, it was pleasing to see them actually in the thick of it, and for what it counts, even though it's not really elevated them anywhere, it's just a morale boost for them when they sorely need it, with Martini departing and all that conjecture about where their own future lies in terms of whether they're reliant on pay drivers merely to survive.
Well, it would have been terrible if Sergei finished the season without having scored a point, because he would have been the only driver on the grid not to score this season. So yeah, now that all the drivers are on the board, I think it will be a bit more acceptable to see out the season. Yeah,
I think he's honestly not gone wrong too badly at all, Sirotkin, but he's just been dealt a pretty savage hand with the Williams, and you just hope that, like you see so many, obviously we'll talk about Van Dorn shortly, but it doesn't do their confidence any good, so you just got to work on the small victories, and hopefully this for him is just a little morale booster.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of Van Dorn and McLaren, no points again for McLaren. Fernando Alonso retired pretty early on in the race as well. I think saving power unit components or whatever. So, yeah, not really a race that McLaren was going to be. And hopefully, again, like Red Bull, that in Singapore, it might suit them better with less emphasis on the power unit and whatnot. But, yeah, McLaren, will talk about them anyway in regards to the silly season. But, yeah, it's not really looking better for them at the moment, which is terrible to see. So, at the conclusion of this race, it's a 30-point lead now for Hamilton over Vettel in the title race. And, yeah, that grasp on a fifth title for Hamilton sort of tightening, which, we didn't think we would say, considering after Belgium there was the optimism that we would see perhaps the lead change again in the next few races. But it looks like, perhaps this time Hamilton's going to stay on top. It's going to take a DNF or something, or even multiple DNFs for Vettel to sort of get that ascendancy back. But, Monza, real hammer blow in the heartland of Ferrari, mind you, as well, that which would have dealt them a big shock as well.
Yeah, you couple that to Vettel in front of his own home crowd at Germany, and you think about this being the point where everything came undone for them last season, and that gap was even narrower at that point of Singapore, that catastrophic friendly fire, and that was really the point of no return. And on this occasion, he's even further adrift, and you just think back to where it was after the British Grand Prix, and it really looked like Ferrari was completely in the ascendancy, and Vettel of his own volition at Hockenheim bins it, then Hungary, a bit unfortunate with the weather for qualifying, but then that pit stop blunder, that was more Ferrari's end in the race, getting bogged down behind Bottas as Ferrari were again hampered by him at Italy. And then you go to Belgium. Yes, he got it right, but Hamilton played the smart card there and settled for second. And then you come here and Vettel, who knows, could have gone a little bit differently. Could have backed out, and you could have been at least third. Yeah. Who knows? Dare we say second without that? Raikkonen undoubtedly would have been made to play ball, but that's all just in recent times. We'll talk about it anyway, I think, in coming weeks when it becomes clearer whether the season is over for Ferrari. But Vettel's dropped 60, 70 points when you look over every little run-in he's had dating back to Azerbaijan, and you think about that, and you think about France, and you think about Austria, even with that grid drop. It's just numerous, and it does beg the question, based on last season, whether he just can't handle that pressure. And credit to Hamilton, he's always there to pick up those pieces.
But this is the thing, Vettel, back when he won the 4 championships with Red Bull, sure, 2010 you pointed out that he was making mistakes as well, given that it was that first year that he was really in title contention. But still, he won the championship by not much. If he hadn't made those mistakes, he could have been daylights ahead, like 2011, 2013, for example. But, we would have thought that by maturing over the years, and now with Ferrari as well, that he would probably be a more polished driver. But it seems like it's not the case.
No, it's really a stage where Ferrari will be wondering, if not now, then when is it possible? But I guess we'll talk about it more in the formal discussion, but it's just varying times.
We might as well discuss it now anyway. All over Red Rover perhaps after this race, and Nico Rosberg said after the race, blasting Seb for making too many mistakes, saying that, you can't beat Lewis Hamilton by making this many mistakes. And it's not akin to Sebastian Vettel, who was clinical and methodical in the way he won those 4 championships previously. Yes, and we can't say now that he doesn't have the best car, because at the moment Ferrari do have the best car, and as I said last week, Ferrari have the best car, but will they be able to maximise it? Will they be able to win in all those other areas, the other variables, such as your pit stops, your strategy, driver error? Can they win in those areas and then win? Because that's how Mercedes have won for so long. It wasn't just because they had the best car. Imagine if Mercedes was making pit stop errors.
They just had the synergy across all those departments.
Yeah, it's not just about having the best car, it's about having the synergy across all the departments, you say. And if Mercedes was making these errors back in 2014, 15, 16, then they might not have won those championships, or they would have won them, but by not as much of a distance as they did. So, that's still... I can't believe that Ferrari are still being hurt by these things, which we thought that they would have fixed for this season.
And you could even say that they started to show this sign of overcoming Mercedes last season and they bottled it there, and this time it's more of an outright advantage, and yet they don't seem to be any more at ease and assured of what they can utilise it for and have a bit of breathing space. They seem to have this almost perceived pressure issue where they create the headaches for themselves when Mercedes are really quite well adrift in real terms, but they just, I guess, based on what they have achieved, they're always looming at the back of Ferrari's mind. And one problem on their end, strategy-wise, and Vettel just seems to really... not that you would blame Ferrari strategically for causing Vettel's mistakes, but Vettel in turn doesn't seem to handle that wick being turned up. And you must say, on the face of it this season, Raikkonen's been more of a consistent driver without victories. He's had possibly a few chances to have won, but of course he's been made to play that rear gunner. But over the course of a race, he's always there or thereabouts, whereas Vettel either seems to get the job done or he just bottles it completely.
Well, given that, is it 11 podiums that Kimi's had this season?
9 to 8, and Hamilton's got 11.
And the next best driver is Hamilton. After that, you would have thought Sebastian Vettel, being the title contender, would have had more than Kimi Räikkönen. So yeah, while Vettel does have 5 race wins to his name, it's a matter of, all the other races where he's not winning, is he's got to be finishing second or third, and he's not.
And see Hamilton, he has an off weekend and hear all the complaining on the radio, but he's always second or third, and Vettel ends up being 6th or 7th or whatever. It's
exactly.
Valuable points.
Or does not finish the race. So that's where the point comes in, is that, that consistency that you need to win the championship. We said this a long time ago, right after the championship started, and we saw the inconsistency from both ends. We said this championship's going to be won by the driver and the team that makes the least mistakes. And so far, Mercedes are the ones making the least mistakes. Sure, they don't have the fastest car, but in the end, it's about making the least amount of mistakes and scoring the most points, which, Lewis Hamilton is doing at the moment. And I guess you can't really fault that, despite his character or whatever. And it's just, if they're doing the better job on the day, then he's going to be world champion, while Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari are just going to be left to wonder, what they can do to go better next year. But we shouldn't be doing that. We should be focusing on winning today, winning this year, and not making mistakes now, instead of looking forward to doing it all again another year.
And for Hamilton, the case could be made that he's driving as well as ever in a car that's clearly not the class of the field, and he seems to thrive on those moments where he has a bit of a sniff, he goes in for the kill, and then Vettel, it's just a matter of time, it seems, he does choke, and you can see that when he does pull ahead Hamilton, he becomes quite peerless, and as much as we have our opinions about him, it's hard to go past him as the driver of the generation, just for the fact that he just lifts it to this pedestal where through his mere presence he's created this aura, and he really just makes the results happen for him, whereas someone like a Vettel, he just seems very reliant on really everything falling into place for him, having absolutely no pressure. Otherwise, you just smell danger signs pretty much straight away.
Yeah, well, unless he can deal with that pressure, then I don't know if he's going to be able to add to that tally of 4 championships that he's already had. So, yeah, you could almost argue it's over now, but I guess we've got to wait across the next couple of races: Singapore, Japan, Russia. Singapore again on paper. See, after last year, I have no confidence about Ferrari just coming out and dominating in Singapore. You would have thought that a couple of years ago, but after what happened last year, a little bit of rain again, as you say, created that pressure, and going into turn 1, it was, we all remember what happened. So it's hard to say with confidence now that, Ferrari have the best car, but, anything like that could just ruin it for them on the day, or they ruin it for themselves. So, we're just going to have to wait and see come Sunday in Singapore in a couple of weeks' time to see how things pan out. And if at the checkered flag, Sebastian or Ferrari win, then, you can definitely say with confidence perhaps they're back in the hunt.
Well, for Hamilton, he has that luxury now of of playing that longer game. He can settle for the seconds or thirds, depending on the circumstance ahead of him. But if the opportunity does present itself again, he doesn't have to be the one leading from lap one. He might just end up with another win, and it just seems
it's what Nico Rosberg did in 2016. He only had to finish second or third in the last 4 races of the year, and he just finished second in all 4 of them. So, they'll probably be playing that game, given that he's got that 30-point lead. And I keep saying, power units, when are these guys going to start taking penalties? Surely, because Bottas has already taken it, Raikkonen's probably on the cusp, so Vettel and Hamilton are probably not too far off either. And I guess with Hamilton having that luxury of the points, they're going to have to consider reliability, and rather than having a DNF to their name, it's better to probably take those penalties and then come back, score a few points, and let Vettel take some points off him. So if I were Mercedes, that's probably the way I'd be thinking, rather than having what happened in Malaysia, for example, a couple of years ago happen again, and that was basically the turning point in that year's championship.
That might be what it does take for Ferrari to feel comfortable, but it's easy enough to say that without that pressure they'll get it done. But who knows, maybe you get one of them take a drop out Singapore, for instance, and then the Red Bulls go and take maximum points if they can get their reliability together, and that'll be major points where Ferrari would want to collect the maximum, and Mercedes will just know that they've got that luxury of really being in the right place at the right time, and Ferrari has a track record now, and it's impossible to ignore at this point.
Yeah, and that's why, we just had to talk about it this time and in great detail. It's, as just being neutral fans or whatever of wanting to see a competitive championship, it's just, at that stage where, I'd take anyone who can beat Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton just for the sake of variety, but Ferrari just doesn't seem to be up to doing it at the moment, and they have the best car, but they just can't get it together, which is the disappointing part.
Yeah, just from the hype, we all thought, I don't know how far back or how soon ago the optimism was there, but it just feels like there was a real gut punch at Italy, and all that optimism after qualifying. It seemed like it was going to be a truly majestic victory, and that one really just doubles that pain.
Yeah, exactly. So enough about that anyway. We'll be back talking about the championship, I guess, in time for Singapore in a couple of weeks. But let's go into the digest now. And straight after the race, there was a flurry of information, a flurry of news that came out in regards to McLaren and the silly season. And we heard last night, or Monday night, that Stoffel Vandoorne's been dropped by the team. Won't be retained for beyond 2018. And not too long after that, McLaren announced that Lando Norris is going to be making his F1 debut for the team. And I'll be honest here, it felt like, or the reaction that I had was that this was a really left field choice by McLaren. I was almost, even though he's their junior driver and you think he's next cab off the rank, I was actually surprised to see his name pop up, given the depth of talent that's currently on the silly season market. Your Esteban Ocons, your Sergio Perez. I even built a case for Sergio Perez to return to McLaren, saying that now he's mature and everything and a team leader. It's what McLaren need at this time. But at the same time, I argued that it almost doesn't matter what driver they put in their car next year or the year after. They've got to fix things in their managerial structure. They need to fix things in their technical department and start building a car, start developing a car that's going to be competitive, not give us this bucket of bolts that this year they've not developed, or so we're led to believe hasn't been developed on a regular basis. That's not being able to give Stoffel Vandoorne the opportunity to show his skills and talent, and leaving Fernando Alonso as disgruntled as ever.
Oh, just the fundamentals, and it's not going to be that overnight fix. That fantastical thought from Zach Brown at the British Grand Prix, it could be 2 to 10 years. You hope it's certainly not the latter, somewhere in between.
I wouldn't wait 10 years as a fan to... I mean, most football teams, you don't have to wait that long for them to get back into premiership contention or whatever, unless you're Western Bulldogs and you didn't win one for like 60 years or whatever. But yeah, in a Formula One team, you don't want to wait 10 years for someone to regain competitiveness. No offense to Williams fans, but yeah, a team like McLaren who only, well, you say only won their last championship in 2008. Well, that's already been a decade now. So, do we wait another decade for them to get back into championship contention?
Oh, Ferrari went 17 years between 82 and 99. So,
but didn't they win races in between then as well? Like, even just winning a race would be nice at this point, or a podium finish. But going back to Van Dorn, you got to really feel for the guy. And I know we were critical of him at the start of the year because it felt like, he's not putting his best foot forward. But as the year's gone on, he's not really been given the opportunity because the car he has. And it's almost like, Kevin Magnussen all over again when he got dumped by McLaren for not doing much wrong, I guess. And same with Sergio Perez before that, 2013. They had an uncompetitive car. And Perez couldn't do much more than he was doing and was trying to get the most out of... it's like pushing crap uphill, basically. What can you do?
Oh, Van Dorn was essentially dead on arrival with his McLaren tenure last year. He genuinely was struggling just to complete a race distance. Morale just wasn't there. Clearly Alonso had been jaded by it and that toxic culture that crept in, and then that false optimism with the move to Renault. Everyone's thinking, we've got a bit of a chance here, and when that wasn't realised, you could just see for both of them that they would have checked out. And Van Dorn being so much fresher, he's clearly not got that reputation to trade off, and he's really now thrown into the lion's den there if he's going to have another crack at it. And who knows whether he does face a year in the wilderness, just like Esteban Ocon, rightly or wrongly. It seems as though these guys who probably we foresaw a couple of years ago as the future are facing very uncertain futures.
Well, Magnussen had that year in the wilderness as well, and look where he's come back, even though the Renault stint didn't really work in his favour. But yeah, Magnussen certainly in his stride now at Haas, but in danger, I guess, of being left in the midfield for the rest of his career. Van Dorn, we were likening him, or everyone was likening him to being the next Alain Prost for bloody hell, a couple of years ago before he made his debut. So, the fact that, he's already perhaps on the outer in F1, you'd hope that he finds a seat. But I agree. I think, Esteban Ocon has to find a seat for next year. It's a travesty if he's not on the grid. And again, that's why the whole Norris move sort of stumped me, was that I thought, Mercedes probably would have pushed to get Ocon a seat next year, wherever. He's still in with a chance, I guess. I mean, he could go to Williams if they do that tie-up with Mercedes-Benz to have that technical alliance there. But yeah, for the sake of being in a semi-competitive drive, you would have thought that Ocon at McLaren could have been possible. But yeah, it's not to take anything away from Lando Norris. He's done a great job in Formula 2 this year. He's at 18 years old. He's definitely a driver to look forward to being in F1 in the future if he gets a long-term stint out of it. That's what we said about Magnussen, what we said about Van Dorn as well, going to McLaren. I don't want the same thing to now happen to Lando Norris in a couple of years' time.
It's a poison chalice, and clearly as long as McLaren's not making any kind of progress, it's going to be impossible for any of these guys to be gauged in realistic terms. Yeah,
he could have been better off going in the Toro Rosso for next year, so, it's just, yeah, as I said before, it doesn't really matter who they have in the car. It's until they start getting the development happening again and ironing out what's going on with their management and everything, which, it looks like perhaps it's happening, but their technical department's still a bit unsure about what's going on there, with James Key yet to be released by Red Bull, and McLaren saying that the terms that Red Bull are asking for are a bit unreasonable in this situation. So, they're sort of left in that situation where, what do we do here? And
they'll just get Norris and Sainz to design the car themselves.
Oh, they could do that. Or I was going to say that they've reached out to Pat Fry potentially to come back and help design the car for next year at least. He, after Manor folded. I think he's working with the FIA or with the Formula One group or whatever on their little Ross Brawn's little technical team. So, potentially he could come back to McLaren where he was before he was at Ferrari, of course. So, yeah, they've got to sort out this stuff before we worry about what kind of drivers we got on the team and whether they're performing or not. Because if the team's not performing, don't scapegoat the drivers, but it's the third time that this has happened for McLaren. Perez, Magnussen, now poor Van Dorn.
You just hope there's another chapter for him.
Yeah, well, and let's keep the theme of scapegoating drivers going. A driver who was scapegoated to the maximum last year, the year before, is now on the radar to actually come back to Formula One with the team that he was scapegoated by, and that's Danny Kvyat, in frame to come back to Toro Rosso. And this was sort of intensified with some a chat between Red Bull and Ferrari, between Christian Horner and Christian Horner or Helmut Marko, one of the two.
Both of them were there, and
they're always there with Marko having Horner on his leash. Of course, there wouldn't be any other way. Those two chatting to Maurizio Arrivabene because, of course, after Red Bull let Kvyat go, he became a Ferrari affiliated driver, and now they're talking about potentially releasing him back to Red Bull to go to Toro Rosso. So what this silly season just gets sillier all of a sudden. Next we'll be talking about potentially putting Esteban Gutierrez in the car, and he was in the paddock as well in Monza.
Just further undermines Toro Rosso's remit again, that shortfall and the way they actually probably promoted Kvyat prematurely in that first instance. This is what's culminated with the 3 or 4 years, this vortex of drivers coming and going, some real left field contenders recalling ex-alumni like a Brendan Hartley, and now there's potential again for Kvyat to return. And it's just again, it's a shame when you think, just like with McLaren, they're getting someone unproven. In this case, they're going back to perhaps an old hand when there's such other guys like an Ocon ready to go.
Well, nothing against Kvyat, because I guess he was unfairly treated, but it's just the way that Red Bull system is working at the moment. The fact, it churned out so many drivers in the beginning, but now they're bone dry, basically. Jean-Eric Vergne's already said he's not coming back because he's happy being in a championship where he can actually win championships and races. He doesn't want to come back to F1 where he's going to be fighting for 9th or 10th. So I can see his point of view, and F1 is meant to be the pinnacle, but the fact that these guys who were regarded as being, the future, as you said before, and being the best of the best, they never got to rise to the top, basically, and that's why they've gone off elsewhere to try and win there. And we saw that with Brendan Hartley. He got turfed by Red Bull ages ago, and then his chance with Mercedes didn't really yield anything, so he went off to sports cars. He won a couple of championships. He won a Le Mans. Jean-Eric Vergne, Formula E champion now. He's racing in Endurance Championship as well. The list goes on.
With the exception of Vettel, really, and Verstappen,
and Ricciardo as well.
I guess you could say to an extent, but not to the extent he's going to be put forward as the future of the team. So he's met an end despite the fact he could have represented their next hope. And you think about Verstappen, though, he was more of a hired hand than anything. Toro Rosso seems to be a means to an end, and very few do make it through there to Red Bull and then go on to achieve the great heights because they're cut down before their time has come, or really marginalised, as you've seen with Webber. He came in, I guess, after a stint technically with them at Jaguar, and then he never had a chance with Vettel there, and now Ricciardo's already been cast aside in deference to Verstappen. So it's just an absolutely ruthlessly cynical organisation, so you can see why so few are that keen to go back into that cauldron if they're asked, and as a result, who knows, it might be that last one on the table, like a Kvyat, who takes it merely because no one else is keen.
Well, I just have to agree with Vergne's sentiment that why would he go back to being in the midfield, or not even on the beyond the midfield or whatever, when he's somewhere where he's actually winning in a world-class championship with a depth of strong, talented drivers like Formula E has and the World Endurance Championship. So, yeah, you got to give it to him on that one. So, and our last little bit of silly season news is that despite his heroics in Monza to score pole position, it looks like the Ferrari organisation is getting ready to replace Kimi Raikkonen with Charles Leclerc. So we thought that all died down following the tragic news about Sergio Marchionne. But John Elkann and the new Ferrari chairman and Louis Camilleri look like they're going to take that step and give Kimi the sack for next year. So not even letting him go out on his own terms. It's like, right, even though you've scored this pole position for us and you've been really consistent with the podiums, 8 or 9, as you said, for the season, you're going to be shown the door.
Yeah, talk of honouring the wishes of Marchionne, who had seen Leclerc as the future, and the notion that he was some visionary who wanted to progress things rather than live in the past. I guess the things move pretty quickly, but Raikkonen, I guess you can always make that statement that when it comes up to renewal time, he gets his act together. But in this case, it's been as convincing as it's been at any point in this second tenure for him, and really probably should have by right won it at Italy, and just driving as well as ever. So you would think at this stage he does deserve to genuinely be renewed on his terms, and whatever comes of 2019, you've got to consider for Leclerc that there's every chance that he won't be quite ready after a single season, and that logic of another year at Sauber or a slight move up, I guess, to Haas, that suddenly doesn't seem to be the case at all.
Well, and also, I guess there was that thing over the week after qualifying, seeing Kimi Raikkonen's wife emotional, and there was that talk that the emotion was because she already had been, or Kimi was already informed that he's no longer required for 2019 or whatever. It was just an outpouring of emotion. But yeah, it's just, sort of in the middle of before the mid-season break, I was all for, right, we've got to look at the future. Maybe it's time that Kimi moved on. But then when you look back at his performances this year, I'm like, well, I'd rather if it was on his own terms, and it doesn't, if he loses his Ferrari seat, he's not going to be on the grid next year. He's not going to go backwards to a Sauber, or there was that talk maybe he'd go to McLaren or whatever, which can't happen now anyway. But yeah, that'll be it for Raikkonen. So we lose 2 world champions next year with Alonso going, Kimi Raikkonen going as well, and all of a sudden, a whole generation of drivers has disappeared off the grid.
Yeah, on a personal level, it'll be a bit hollow when I consider in the realm of Michael Schumacher's glory days, when you had Alonso and Raikkonen and Button and all that who have gone in the past few years.
Yeah,
that'll be a completely clean cut, and it'll be essentially Lewis Hamilton will be the old man of the field, and it's quite a strange feeling when you consider that. Yeah, he'll be 34 next season, but it just feels like that's from a completely different time than the one when I was in my formative years of following, so it's just not quite going to be the same.
Yeah, exactly. So all of a sudden we have 2 big names leave, whereas we thought it was just going to be Alonso who'd be gone as well, and gone to IndyCar, it looks like, with him doing a test. They said this week that was confirmed by McLaren. And speaking of IndyCar, to round up the digest, so yeah, we're counting down to the end of their season with 1 race to go in the championship, and here in Portland over the weekend. So they had 3 rounds in a row. They had a triple header, which is amazing, and right at the end of the championship too. I guess it builds that intensity. So it was Takuma Sato who won over the weekend, and more importantly for the championship, Scott Dixon managed to extend his lead over Alexander Rossi to 29 points. So that's the gap going into the final race, with double points on offer at Sonoma, I believe. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting finale, and I think it looks like that Dixon might have this one already in one hand.
Based on his heroics at Portland when he escaped about a 7-car pile-up, you'd think he's clearly blessed for this season. He just seems to always extract those results even when he's not taking the victories, and he's been the best driver over the course of a season, as much as Rossi's come home with a a wet sail, so all he has to do is keep himself really out of trouble at the finale, and he'll have another crown.
Yeah, and the Penske driver's no longer in contention either. So Joseph Newgarden and Will Power, unfortunately, even though Power did, win over the weekend before Portland and at the Gateway or whatever. So yeah, it's been an interesting championship, and of course with the impending arrival of Fernando Alonso next year, as I said all throughout the season, that it's really going to give that championship a boost as far as viewership goes. And yeah, we're not the biggest IndyCar fans as such, but it's hard not to keep one eye on it now, given that we've got Alexander Rossi. Ever since Alexander Rossi went over there, I've had one eye sort of on it, and now with Fernando Alonso going, it'd be great to watch how he goes in that championship overall as well, with the likes of Will Power, Scott Dixon, and the usual bunch that are at the front of that field.
And credit has to be given alone to IndyCar. It's built its own base with those household names, and just the attractiveness of the racing. It's become such a level after about a decade since that reunification we keep mentioning, and we hope that, I guess, the cream on top will be an Alonso arriving, and it can reach that mania levels that we had in the early to mid-90s.
Yeah, it'll be Mansell Mania. It'll be Alonso Mania instead of Mansell Mania, basically. A quick shout out to Mansell anyway. Raikkonen became the oldest pole sitter since Mansell in 1994 when he took pole at the Australian Grand Prix that year. The final race in Adelaide it was that year. So, props to Kimi for doing that. But let's cap things off this week with the sporting moments of the week, of course. And catching your eye this week was?
Oh, not so much as a highlight. Probably a low light, more of a personal one. Again, probably heard over the year, my good running friend in Dion, he's probably based his whole year around an upcoming 100-kilometre championship race this weekend, set for Croatia, and unfortunately he's laid low, as so many runners are, in untimely fashion about a month ago, and time's just beaten him to recover for that run. He's pulled the pin on it, and probably a smart call, but just a real shame when you think about how much effort goes in. You base a 12-month plan around getting yourself up for it, and just shows you sometimes it's not meant to be, but he'll still be travelling overseas, and being part of that support crew, he'll have a great time, part of that culture, and there's some other events that he'll be participating in his time over there, so it won't be as though the trip has been a complete loss, and just hope for him he bounces back to bigger and better things. And it just shows you in any sporting context that sometimes you just got to ride those waves and you come back better and stronger the next time.
Well, you're only just human, of course, so if your body cannot withstand it, I guess, or if you're injured or whatever, you can only time can heal wounds, basically, in that case. So hopefully he does, as you say, bounce back to bigger and better things. Will he be right for the one that you're doing in October, the Melbourne Marathon, or probably?
Yeah, I dare say you'll probably do it for a bit of fun after
maybe
these other
just
ones.
a half marathon or something for that time.
You just got to play it by ear. One of those things with the running, you just never know. Body has some strange reactions after some big events. It's always a bit of a week-to-week proposition.
Yeah, exactly. So that should be good when that comes around anyway. For you even, it'd be good to see you in action for the first time in 5 years or whatever. So, but yeah, let's cap things off. And I've been talking about it for the last few weeks, but it's finally over, the farewell tour for Jonathan Thurston. The game on Saturday, so much emotion. Pre-game, during the game, after the game, and yeah, it's just hard to believe that that's the end of the great JT's career. And I guess if I'm just to pick one highlight of the game and talk about that as being my highlight for the week, it was how time after time he set up his old mate Gavin Cooper for a try, and it was just good to see them in form together again. Vintage JT, vintage Gavin Cooper, and of course, on track for en route to a big win for the Cowboys too over the Gold Coast Titans. So yeah, it's just going to be sad next year not being able to see those two set up plays for each other, but I guess all good things come to an end, and that's the end of the JT dynasty at the North Queensland Cowboys and in the NRL.
Yeah, just a bit of a damn squib the way they won't feature in September, but those memories of what he achieved probably 2015, that infamous kick, and then everything in Origin, and of course his contribution when it comes to developing the game on the Indigenous front. He's been a real pioneer.
Yeah, which he'll continue doing as well, I'm sure, up in the north with the Indigenous communities, with youth as well in particular. So I think, off the field as well, JT, just an incredible human being from what we've seen and heard about the man.
Yeah, he won't be going too far. I think he'll still be very much involved. Who knows which capacities? Maybe he'll do some commentary, might get involved in coaching, dare we say, so he won't be lost to the game by any means.
Yeah, the immortal in waiting, I guess. So, I'd love to say let's have a 4X in his honour, but we're never going near that stuff.
Yeah,
so,
sorry to draw the line there.
Yeah, or Bundaberg in that case, which is the other beverage that the Queenslanders seem to promote. Yeah, so unfortunately, poor choice in beverages there, JT, but I'm sure we'll have something to cap off what has been a great career for Jonathan Thurston. So, yeah, thanks for tuning in very much. Thanks very much for tuning in. Apologies as well. We've recorded this edition a bit early this week. So by the time we post it, if any other news is broken, well, that's bad luck. We'll talk about it next week. So hopefully there is no more driver announcements.
Oh, there
this
will.
week.
As soon as we end this recording, there'll be 3 other announcements.
Oh, yeah. Basically, the whole grid will just go into free fall and whatnot. So, yeah. But until next time, thanks for joining us, and we'll be back to preview Singapore for you next week. So, cheerio.
Till then.